Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back. Today we are reading Hellblazer number 2. But before we get into the issue, just a little reminder, this is the free version, and all that means is that this is way behind where I'm at in our Patreon version. So if you can't get enough, you need more John Constantine, go check us out on patreon.com/planes, trains, and comic books, and sign up for the Hellblazer tier, where you'll get access to the entire library of recordings I have so far, and also access to our regular podcast where we break down comic book story arcs of all different genres and types. So if any of that interests you, be sure to check out our Patreon at patreon.com/planes, trains, and comic books. All right, let's get into it. So in the last issue, which was the first issue of Hellblazer, we got the introduction to John Constantine as a character. We got to see a little bit of his life. We found out he has a friend named Gary Lester, who through his own hubris has released a hunger demon onto the world and is now killing people in New York. And not knowing what else to do, Gary hits up his old friend John Constantine to help him out. So John takes Gary to New York, and they meet up with another magician named Papa Midnight. And it definitely seemed like Papa Midnight and John did not get along. They both respect that the other has some magic, but they also believe that they are better than the other one. So this set up a fun dynamic between them. So last we saw, John left Gary Lester in the protection of Papa Midnight while he went out to go find the demon on the streets. And at the very end of the last issue, we saw that John did find the demon inside of a church, and it was fully manifested. Prior to this, it was just infecting people, and they were eating their own desires, meaning if you were a muscular guy, you're taking chunks out of your own muscles. If you liked diamonds and stuff, you were going to go to a jewelry store and shove those diamonds in your face. But it seems the demon was fully powered up now from having all these little smaller incidents. So now it has manifest its full form, which looked like a big fly inside of a church downtown. And at the end of the last issue, we saw John running away from the demon, who was named Namath. And the priest who was in the church got possessed and began taking bites out of the wood crucifix that stands tall behind the pulpit. And that is where we left off in the last issue. So first things first, with issue 2, we got the cover. We see more writing and scrolls in the background. We see Papa Midnight, who's kind of ghostly looking, and he's wearing his white top hat with white suit jacket and then nothing but his loincloth underneath that. And on top of him looks like very colorful symbols that look possibly tribal. And next to that, we see John entering a doorway from the night as he's smoking, and there's a sign in neon above him that says Midnights. And on the cover, we can see that this is written by Jamie Delano with art by John Ridgway. And as we turn to the first page, we see John is walking in Manhattan. It's pouring rain, and he doesn't have an umbrella or anything, and he's got his trench coat and a cigarette that I'm assuming is super wet in his mouth. And the narration says, Manhattan, my rain-soaked threads plaster to me in a damp embrace. Feet squirm in saturated shoes. Then we see him approach a club that has in neon above the door the word midnight, and John says hello to the doorman, and the narration continues. I shiver as the memory of Namath trickles a cold track down my spine. I must be losing my grip, letting the hunger spirit sucker me into a confrontation. So John enters the Midnight Club, and he drops off his wet trench coat and begins walking around the club. And the first thing he sees is just a regular dance floor, and as he overlooks that, the narration says, the club is buzzing, all manner of style strutting its stuff, but I'm not here for dancing. I'm here to see the boss. Then John continues walking down some stairs, and as he's going down, he's going to different levels of stuff, and he's passing different rooms. So the first room he passes, the narration says, he's not in the secret casino where the high rollers sweat off $100 bills. Then he passes another room where a live sex show seems to be going on and possibly an orgy, and the narration continues. Or watching the punters pay for someone else to sweat. Suppose a live sex show is better than a dead sex show. Then he gets to the final level, and we see a giant crowd surrounding two men who are on top of a stage, and everybody's cheering at them, and they are fighting. Each man has a weapon that looks kind of like a bat, and they aren't wearing any clothes except a loincloth. And as John sees this, his narration continues, in Papa Midnight's place, the death is generally downstairs, in the arena. And as the two men fight, we can hear the crowd yelling, break his face, Kill! Maim him! Choke the mother! Stomp his head! Kill, 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 kill. So Papa Midnight has a private area that overlooks the whole arena, and John goes up there, and as he walks in, he sarcastically says, "Hello, I'm from the League Against Cruel Sports." And Midnight turns around and says, "Ah, Constantine, you don't approve of the entertainment? I didn't take you for a squeamish man." And John replies, "Well, chum, seeing two guys beat each other to a pulp with baseball bats doesn't really turn me on." And as they're talking in this room, we are seeing behind them like a flash of what's going on in the arena. So we're seeing the two men who are very obviously zombies because they look like the zombie that John ran into in the kitchen earlier in the last issue. And like John said, in these flashes, the men are just hitting each other with bats as hard as they can. So that's going on in the background while they're talking. And Papa Midnight continues, "Nor I. The violence is merely a symbol to release the energy of bloodlust. No more than may be seen in a movie or a newscast, except here they can smell it." And John replies, "Rough on the actors." And Midnight says, "Ha! They are nothing, zombies, dead already. It is the roar of the crowd that excites me. A Houngan must draw power from many sources, and power is needed to defeat this rogue spirit." And John chimes in, "Not to mention low animal cunning." And Midnight replies to that, "Yes, your forte, I believe. I had a long talk with your unwholesome friend. You are a ruthless and deceitful man, Constantine." And Constantine replies, "Well, nobody's perfect." And as he says this line, we see one of the zombies in the arena has definitely won the fight. And since the crowd is chanting, "Kill, kill, kill, kill," the winning zombie takes the bat and swings it as hard as he can at the other zombie who's down on the ground and smashes his head. And surprisingly, I guess that was a really hard hit because even though John and Midnight are in a faraway private area, the blood still reaches John's face and he has to shield his eyes as it rains down. And Midnight sees this and says, "I hope your stomach's strong enough, John. If you flinch, disaster." But John looks him square in the eyes and says, "Don't worry, chum. I can handle it." And then John takes out his handkerchief and wipes off his face and hands. And we see the name of this issue is called A Feast of Friends. So as John wipes himself off, he asks Papa Midnight, "Where is Lester, by the way?" And Midnight answers, "Ah, yes, the bait. I put him in the pens." Then we cut to John and Midnight in the pens, as Papa Midnight called them. And all this is just basically a cell block where there's a room with a long hallway and there's cells with bars every 5 feet or so. And we see Midnight has already been talking to John, and we're cutting into the conversation as he says, "The smell of fear always helps the jaguar to find the goat." And John replies, "All right, don't rub it in." Then he goes to the cell in front of them, and we see that Gary is locked inside of this one. And John goes to the bars and says, "Hello, Gaz." And Gaz is just the nickname John has for Gary Lester. And it is very obvious that Gary Lester is terrified and doesn't know why he's been locked in this cell. And he says to John, "John, what's happening, man? You said he'd have some gear. Why has he locked me up?" And then he grabs John through the bars by his lapels, and in desperation he yells, "I'm scared, John. I think he's gonna kill me. Make him give me some junk, please, John." And if you don't remember, junk is just code word for heroin, so Gary is a heroin addict, and he was promised by John that Midnight would give him some, but apparently Midnight just locked him in the cell and did not give him any. So John grabs Gary by the wrists, and he forces him off of his jacket, and he says, "Nothing's going to happen to you, Gaz." And we see John's narration say, "It's true. The more he pleads, the easier it is to lie." Then John turns away from him, and he begins to get a cigarette to light, and as he removes it, he says to Gary, "But you've got to stay down here for a while and sweat it out. You can't have any junk in your system." And Gary says, "Why not? I need it." And as John calmly lights his cigarette, he says, "Because we've got to catch the moth first. It knows you and it wants you. Your need is going to lure it close. Then, bingo. Midnight puts a heavy whammy on it, and it's all over. Bar the shouting." And that is not at all what Gary wanted to hear, so he reaches out to John, who is just out of his reach, and he says, "No, John, please. You can't let it near me. I can't take it. You don't know what it's like, John. What it'll do." And then John's narration says, "I remember the priest again. The one from the last issue who ate the crucifix." And John says, Sure I know, Gaz. And then John passes Gary the lit cigarette, and as he does that, all of a sudden the doors open in the hallway, and we see the winner zombie from that arena fight is carrying the loser he defeated, and John continues, "It's the only way, mate. It has to be done. After all, you let it go. You're responsible." And Gary tries to protest, but John cuts him off saying, "You have to trust me. I've never let you down. We're friends, remember?" And as all that was being said, we see the zombie go over to Papa Midnight, who's also in the hallway, and he drops the loser zombie's body in front of Midnight, and then it looks like Midnight reaches out with a staff and puts it on his shoulder, so he's doing some kind of magic. And Gary replies to John saying, "Sorry, John. Of course I trust you. But that Midnight, he freaks me out. My head's so scrambled up." And John says, "Don't worry a thing, old son. It's all under control." And just in case you didn't get it, obviously John's lying, and it's very obvious to us, the reader, because the next panel we see is John finishing his sentence to Gary as he winks at him and gives him an okay sign, which is very out of character for John unless he's lying to you, apparently. So as John winks and says okay with his hand, he says, "Stay cool, and this time tomorrow we'll be on our way home." And as John says this, Midnight walks up to him with a big smile because he knows that John is deceiving his friend. And the narration says, "Midnight's a vicious bastard. Got a smile like an open wound." And John and Midnight begin to walk away, and Gaz yells behind them, "Don't leave me down here." And Midnight looks at John and says, "He told me you were friends as children." And as they walk away from Gary's screams, John says, "Do shut up, Pops, before you get boring." Then they get on an elevator to leave the area, and the narration says, "The elevator rushes upward as I have no words left. I'm shattered, a dead man, a zombie, reanimated by a cold hand wound deep in my gut." And as John rides in the elevator, he puts his hand on his head like he's feeling guilty or something, and Papa Midnight says to him, "I suggest you gather your energies. We fight the hunger spirit at dawn." Then we cut to a crazy room that apparently John has been given by Papa Midnight because Papa Midnight owns not only the club on the first floor and the penthouse on the top, he owns the whole building, and I guess there's rooms on the other floors in between. So the room he's given John is very African themed. There's a tiger skin on the bed and a cheetah print headboard. There's a wood shield with some spears hanging on the wall, and there's pictures of elephants and stuff as artwork. And for some ungodly reason, the room is all yellow, the carpet's yellow, the walls are painted yellow. So not a very easy room to get comfortable in, I would think. And we see John standing in the middle of the room on a zebra rug, and he's naked except for some briefs he's wearing. And the narration over this panel says, "What turns you on then, Constantine? Feeling like a snake, I slough off a skin of moist, clinging clothes. The oblivion of sleep calls me with a black, empty mouth, but my body has a more immediate need." And that need is to go to the restroom. So as John walks through the door of the restroom, he is greeted by a ghostly version of a nun. And his narration says, "The last person I expected to find in the Kazi is Sister Anne Marie." And then John says out loud, "Oh Christ." So I'll fill you guys in on a little history of John Constantine since this is relevant to this section. So in Swamp Thing, that is the first appearance of John. He was created by Alan Moore. And in that, there was a storyline where John had a bunch of friends. One of them was this nun that he's looking at right now. Then he had a biker friend and a nerdy friend and a woman we've already heard about from the last issue who's named Emma. And all of these friends died during that Swamp Thing run when they were trying to defeat something called the Brujeria, which was a magical group. And they are the ones who sent a monster named the Involche to attack Emma and kill her, and that is exactly what it did, so she died. And then we also saw in Swamp Thing this nun, Anne Marie, get killed by the Involche as well. And the biker and the nerd were killed by a betrayer in the circle of friends who was a woman who ended up dying during that whole story arc. And the ghosts of these friends have been haunting him because they have died while trying to help John, and he's feeling guilty about not being able to save any of them. So as he sees the nun, Anne Marie, he turns and he puts his hands in his head and he begins to run away. And the narration says, "The runaway train is steaming through my head." And he says out loud, "What have I done to deserve this?" So John tries to run and hide in the closet, but as he opens the door, he sees two more ghosts. They're the ones of the biker named Frank and his nerdy friend Benjamin. And John exclaims, "Frank? Benjamin?" And his narration says, "It's a regular haunting. Then John shuts the closet door on them, and he turns around and he looks towards the window, and he sees the curtains have a little bump in them. And as he looks down, he sees two little feet poking out, and they are ghostly feet. And his narration says, "The train in my head is screaming up the hill. The pressure's too high. She's going to blow. Better get angry, John. It's the only way to cope." So John does just that. He walks over to the curtains kind of angry, and he pulls them open suddenly, and we see Emma, the ghost, is standing there in front of him. And we did see her last time because he went to her apartment in New York, and he did talk to her ghost then. And John immediately begins to yell at her, saying, "All right, Emma, what the hell do you want now? Why have you filled my bleeding room with dead people?" But she doesn't say anything to him. She just blankly stares at him and then walks towards the other ghosts, which have all come out of their respective rooms, and now they're just standing in the center of the room staring at him. And John yells at them, "Well, bloody say something then!" And his narration says, "She looks at me as if I've just crawled out from under a stone." Then John turns around because he can't face them, and his narration continues. "8 dead eyes bore into the back of my neck, accusing." And then John says, still staring away from the ghosts, "Look, what do you want me to say? I'm sorry the Involce killed you all? Of course I am. It nearly got me too, you know." Then he spins round and points at them, saying, "You all knew the risks. You were playing for high stakes, the highest. Gambling's a funny business, kids. Sometimes you lose." But they still don't say anything to him. They just look at him judgingly. So John just walks towards the bed like he's about to get in it, and his narration says, "I think of Gary Lester sweating it out downstairs in Midnight's pens. He was born a loser." And then something clicks in his mind, and he realizes that the ghosts are here because he feels guilty about what's about to happen to Gary. So he looks at the ghosts and he says, "So that's it? Listen, he's an idiot. He brought it on himself. I wish there was another way, but there's not. So you lot can mind your own goddamn business." And then John begins to climb under the covers of the bed like he's going to go to sleep, and his narration says, "Am I really trying to justify this to a bunch of ghosts or myself?" And then as he gets settled into the bed, pulling the covers up over himself, he looks at the ghosts and says, "If there's any guilt, it's mine. I'm the one who will have to handle it, just like I handle it over you. Guilt is the providence of the living." And with that, John is done talking to these ghosts, so he begins to wave at them, telling them to shoo, and John says to them, "That's all, folks. Show's over. You can all sod off now. I want to sleep." And then he reaches to turn off the light, and it doesn't seem like the ghosts are actually moving, so he just says to them, "Close the door on your way out." And then he clicks off the light, and the narration says, "In the darkness, the only sound is the relentless dynamo hum of the city. I wonder if they're gone." Then he clicks the light back on, and he looks up, and all the ghosts are in fact gone, and John's narration says, "They have. For one ludicrous moment, I almost missed them, especially Emma. It's a big bed, and I could do with some company. I lie down again, and a smothering sleep bubbles towards me like tar." Then he hears Emma's voice say, "Good night, John," and his narration continues. "Her soft voice next to my ear is the last straw. I suffocate my sudden sobs in the pillow and wait for dawn." Then we zoom out of the building and we see the tower that he's in, and then we zoom out some more to see more of the city and the buildings, and then we see that the hunger demon is flying around in between the buildings very high up, and the narration says, "The night is a carnival of wings. Rise now into the seething sky. Boil above the tower gardens where bright and fearful flowers grow their lurid blossoms in dark caverns. Follow their scent, the airborne fragrance of hunger. This is a paradise of dark desires. Below, the trembling hearts beat out their tom-tom pulse of desperate need, calling for partners to bear witness, to share their dance of barbed, consuming passion." So on the streets below this flying demon, we're getting shots of previous people who have died from being possessed by the demon and shoving themselves with whatever they love most, like comic books or jewelry or the cross. But it seems the hunger demon can feel all the others out there that are in desperation as well. And his narration continues, "I hear. I come to pluck you, petal by fluttering petal, to plant my furious seeds in the belly of your charmed ecstasy, to sample the nectar of your craving with a discerning tongue. O glorious contorted fruits of agony, feed me with the wine of spoiled lust. See me grow." And then we get an up-close shot of the demon, and It's very cool because his body is made up of millions of flies. And we just see a horde of them flying through the air, but it's all close up. We get extreme detail on the flies' faces, and the narration continues. You want, I give. Your yearning is my breath. Let me crack the pods of your fierce need. Release that bound energy to shoot straight into my swarming heart. Then we get some flashes of the stuff that's happened in the last issue. So the first thing we see is the African child starving, then Gary Lester injecting heroin, and then a bodybuilder who's lifting weights down in his gym. And over these, the narration says, in the hot, dry place, it was a rude cry for sustenance that suckled me. Then, a shriek of pure demand led me to new veins of exquisite nourishment. But this place panders to much rarer tastes. And this is the narration over the bodybuilder in the gym. And it continues. Now, much finer juices of obsession seduce my palate, drawing me to drink tears of frustration from eyes opened to the fullness of gratification. Utter greed devours their flesh, succors me and makes me strong. Our symbiose is holy, terrible and complete. Then we see in the background, behind the swarm of flies, the sun begins to rise, and the narration says, with dawn, a gorgeous rush of fear lifts me from the canyons. Our flight song drones. Below, the tower gardens hum in counterpoint. Then we see flashes of Gary Lester being removed from his cell forcefully, and Gary is screaming and freaking out. And the narration continues. Myriad wings slice the first sun rays into spectra. This is a blessed providential world. Then it seems all of a sudden, because Gary is having extreme withdrawals from the heroin and his need is so strong, the demon feels him and the narration continues. Then I taste the strongest flavor yet, a thread of pain that tugs me, calling me to a feast. This is the time, my time. I come. Then we cut to John's bedroom, and he is getting waken up by one of Papa Midnight's zombies. And the narration says, I struggle from the hot darkness. Bedclothes snare my limbs like flypaper. Then as the zombie shakes John, John wakes up saying, What? Who? What time is it? Then he looks up and he sees the zombie, and the narration says, there must be more pleasant ways to be woken up. Then we cut to John getting ready in the bathroom, and he's just like washing his face, and the zombie is looking at him saying, Ugh. And John says, as if to answer him, all right, don't panic, I'm coming. Then we see them enter the elevator, and John is now in his suit again, and he says to the zombie, okay, Joe, let's go. Press the top button, remember? Then as the elevator doors open to the penthouse, John walks out and he sees a very, very beautiful view of the morning sunrise. He sees Papa Midnight standing in front of the window with his arms outstretched, and he also sees Gary Lester is there, and he's being held by two other zombies that are in the room as well. So John takes the scene in, and the narration says, Midnight's private jungle reminds me of the old bog god and the video of Woodrow at Arkham. But that's another story. We've got different business today. Lester looks rough. It'll be easier to face him with shades on. So John puts on his sunglasses, and then we see Gary Lester notice John, and he says, John? But John ignores him and walks over to Papa Midnight, and the narration says, Old Midnight looks like the best-dressed scarecrow in town. And we see Midnight is wearing his usual white top hat, white overcoat, and tribal loincloth and skirt. And Midnight's staring at the window like he's waiting for something, and he's got his arms held out like he's gonna greet it. And we can actually see bugs flying like a cloud of them in front of the sun. So as John walks up to Midnight, he says, Morning, nice day for a race. And Midnight replies, What race? And then John's narration says, The old jokes are still the best. And then John says to Midnight, Ha! The human race, sucker. And Midnight does not look amused by that. He says, Don't waste energy on facile humor. There's work to be done. Then we get a zoom out of John standing next to Midnight, and there's a table in front of them with 3 skulls on it. And John looks down and he says, Just trying to keep our spirits up. And we also see on the table, besides the skulls, there's a knife and a bowl in front of Midnight. And there's also a bunch of other things that we can't quite make out. There's a chicken in front of them in a cage. And the narration says, Best check the equipment. Tattooing needles, ink, straitjacket, hypo, and the chair. Let's have a look at the chair. So John walks over to the chair, and by chair, he literally means an electric chair, like from a prison. And I don't think John was expecting this, because when he sees it, he says, "Bloody hell, where'd you get this?" And Papa Midnight answers, "Private auction. It came from Sing Sing. Over 300 lives have sizzled to extinction on that seat." And John replies, "It's a bit over the top." And then he puts a cigarette out on the armrest of the chair, and Papa Midnight says, "It's powerful magic. Anyway, I thought the irony might amuse you." And John answers, "Yeah, it cracks me up. I hope Lester sees the joke. I'd best have a word with him. Then we'll do it, all right?" Then John walks over to Lester, and he pulls out a cigarette, and he puts it in Lester's mouth, and the narration says, "I feel like a priest bestowing a nicotine absolution." And it's saying that because in the picture, the two zombies are holding Gary's arms, so he can't use them. So John has to place the cigarette in his mouth as if he's taking communion from a priest. Then John says to Gary, "Good morning, Gaz. How are you doing?" And Gary answers, "It's no good, John. I can't go through with it. I'm out of my depth." And John's narration says, "Out of his depth," he says, as he goes down for the third time. So John lights Gary's cigarette, and in a very fake, cheery way, he says, "Don't be daft, pal. It'll be a doodle." And Gary, who's getting more and more freaked out, drops the cigarette from his mouth, and he says, "I mean, you'll have to call it off." And with a straight face, John answers him saying, "No can do, son. Just imagine, you're at the dentist, and I'm your mom. Be a good, brave boy, and afterwards, when it's all over, I'll give you a treat." And then John pulls out a needle of heroin, and he says, "All the way from Thailand, mate." And they don't show Gary agreeing to help them or anything. But in the next panel, we see Gary is now shackled to the chair like he's about to be executed. And I should say that now they've moved everything out onto the balcony. So now they're out in the open, and they are waiting for this demon to come. And Gary turns to John, and he says, "Give it to me now, please." And John answers, "No, later." And we also see in the background of this panel that the zombies have sat down, and they are playing some hand drums. And Papa Midnight has removed the chicken and has the ceremonial knife, and it looks like they're about to start. And as Papa Midnight holds up the chicken, John's narration says, "Midnight starts his mumbo jumbo, and the drums start beating like a pumping heart. Looks like another chicken's gonna bite the dust." Then we see Papa Midnight cut the throat of the chicken, and the narration continues. "I suddenly remember Gaz's mom. I can see her clear as yesterday. A large, slow woman hanging over a gate, calling him in for tea. She wanted him to be a doctor. Dead now, I think. Cancer. She never did like me. Bad influence, she said. People should listen to their mothers." And as this narration's going on, we're seeing Papa Midnight drain the chicken's blood into a bowl, and then he takes a feather from that chicken and a full bowl of blood, and he walks over to Gary, and he begins to splash Gary with the feather that is now dipped in blood. And as we turn the page, we see the cloud of insects in front of the sun looks a little bit bigger, and as Papa Midnight pours the rest of the blood in a circle around Gary's chair, John is standing behind him, holding up his arms as if he's surrendering or something, and Gary is saying, "Oh, Mother of God, it's coming!" And John's narration says, "He's right. The perfect dawn is tainted by a black dot leaking from the sun. It's whiplash, snaking towards us." And then Gary begins to scream, saying, "Oh no, let me go, please." And as the flies begin to reach the balcony, they start to form up again into the shape of the god Namath, which is of a big giant fly. And John's narration says, "Christ, it's big." And Gary continues, "It's too strong now, John. You'll never hold it. It'll never fit in the bottle, man. The bottle." And finally, Gary realizes there is no bottle to trap the demon in, that he, in fact, is the demon. And the narration says, "Oh dear, the penny's finally dropped." And as Gary realizes what's going on, he says to John, "You haven't got a bottle. How are you going to catch it?" "No. Oh no. Please, no." And just as the realization hits him fully, we see the giant form of Namath fly forward, and he begins to move towards Gary. And Gary yells out, "Constantine, you bastard!" And the narration says, "A blizzard of flies engulfs us. Black snow rattles past us. We'd never hold it if it tried to fight us. If it didn't want to go where we want it to go, inside of Gary Lester." And then we see 3 panels underneath this narration where we just get a picture of what John looks like in the cloud of insects, and he's just staring. We can't see his facial expression because he's got his sunglasses on. And then Gary looks terrified as his eyes are super wide. And Papa Midnight has a very creepy, evil smile on his face. So the cloud of flies begins to gather and move forward towards Lester, and he says, "No, no, 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 no." And he tries to close his mouth, denying access to the flies, and he cannot. They overwhelm him and cover his entire body. And the narration says, "Insects spot his face with sudden warts. In seconds, he's growing a writhing beard of flies. They jostle to enter him. For a second, his eyes meet mine, then are gone, as Nemoth swarms to fill him." So Nemoth enters the body of Gary Lester, and John reaches over and rips off Gary's shirt, and he prepares the tattoo needle with ink, and the narration says, "He's traumatized from shock. Cut the binding marks into flesh like putty. Have to work fast. He could come to at any moment." And just as he thinks moment, Gary wakes up and he is feral. And we see now covering his face and arms, Gary has all the same binding marks that were cut into the flesh of that African child from the beginning that Gary got Nemoth from in the first place. And he's trying to bite John and lash out. He's drooling and possibly even foaming at the mouth. And then as he struggles, the metal shackles in the chair break and he rushes John. And as he does, John yells out, "Gaz, no! Fight it, man! Don't let it do this! Don't let it make you hurt me! I'm your friend!" And surprisingly, this works. Gary actually eases up on him as he grabs John. It's like he was about to push him over the edge of the balcony. And actually, there was so much force behind that push that John's sunglasses do end up falling off the balcony. But as Gary hears John's pleas, he begins to settle down like he is gaining control over his body and Nemoth. And John slowly removes Gary's hands off of him, and he says, "It's John Constantine. You don't want to hurt me." So for the moment, Gary is still calm, and John is able to walk Gary over to Papa Midnight, who has the straitjacket ready. And as they put it on him, John says, "Just slip this on. It'll keep you safe and warm." And Gary mumbles to him, "What have you done to me, John?" But I'm assuming John doesn't answer because we cut to him cinching up the last straps of the straitjacket, and John's narration says, "I feel him start to tense again." Then Gary becomes lucid and he begins screaming, "Kill me, John! Don't let it have me!" Then John pulls out a heroin needle and he injects it into Gary's neck vein. And the narration says, "I wish I could, but he and Nemoth have to consume each other. The heroin is as much of a mercy stroke as I can manage." So as the heroin takes effect, Gary calms down and says, "Why has this happened to me?" And the narration says, "He wouldn't understand how some people are doomed from the word go, how they devour themselves, searching for annihilation." Then John reaches out and he takes Gary's head in his hands and he leans forward and kisses Gary on the forehead. And the narration says, "His forehead is cool to my lips, like a dead man's." Then John says to Midnight, "Take him down. I'll follow. Midnight, I want whiskey and cigarettes. Lots of them." And as the zombies pick up Gary, he starts yelling out, "Ah, it's eating me." Then we cut to the cell room down at the very basement of Midnight's building, and we see John is smoking and drinking, and there's literally a pile of cigarettes and 3 empty bottles of whiskey next to John. And the narration says, "On average, it takes 4 minutes to smoke a cigarette. A bottle of whiskey lasts 2 hours. But how bloody long can a man keep screaming?" And we see John is sitting next to the cell that they have Gary in, and Gary's still alive, but he's wasting away because he's saying to John, "Please." And John doesn't answer him, but he does pick up another bottle of whiskey and he smashes the top of it in order to open the bottle. And the narration says, "I need more anesthetic. By the end of the bottle, the screaming is finally stopped, and I think I'm slightly pissed." So having finished that entire bottle, John gets up to the bars and he begins to look through them because it's gone silent in the cell. And until this moment, we don't know what Gary looks like. But in the next panel, we get a full view of Gary's extremely skinny and emaciated body. And also in the cell, holding the body's hand, we see the ghosts of John's friends have returned. Frank, the biker, is giving John the finger, while it looks like Anne-Marie, the nun, is reading the last rites to Gary, and Emma is holding Gary's hand. And the narration says, "I'm glad about that, because the ghosts are having a party, and I don't seem to be welcome. One glance is all I get, then everything catches fire around the edges. Luckily, I'm unconscious before my chin hits the concrete." So that narration made it almost sound like Gary was going to burst into flames, but I think we're talking about John's head here because he is so drunk, he just immediately blacks out. Then we cut to John waking up on the concrete floor, and it looks like he's vomited, and the narration says, I wake up with my head in a pool of spilled whiskey and vomit. My reflection in Papa Midnight's patent leather shoes isn't a pretty sight. And Papa says to John, for a man of power, you leave yourself very vulnerable. And John pulls himself up from the ground, crawling up the wall, and the narration says, at least the ghosts have gone. And then as he holds his head, he says to Midnight, well, you know what they say, work hard, play hard. Man's got to relax sometimes. Anyway, funerals are easier if there's a wake. And then Midnight opens the door to Gary's cell, and John walks in to look at him, and the narration says, Lester's body is completely desiccated, mummified, eyes too dry to close, just like a pharaoh. And as John looks at his dead friend, Midnight says behind him, grief, Constantine, is a luxury. A magician must separate himself from his humanity. But John doesn't answer him. He just looks at his friend Gary and says, sorry, mate, no pyramid for you. And then John turns quickly and walks out of the room, and he says behind him to Midnight, you know something, Midnight? You get right up my bloody nose. I'll see ya. And as John walks away, we see Midnight pointing to Gary's cell, and there's a man standing next to him with a brick in hand and a trowel, and Midnight is saying, brick it up. So it seems instead of removing the body, Papa Midnight's just going to have this cell bricked up, I guess just in case any evil from the moth is still there. So as John walks out of the building, he puts on his trench coat, and the narration says, I want out of this place. I need to put an ocean between myself and Midnight and Gary Lester. And as he exits the building, he notices that the sunglasses that he dropped from the balcony are right there on the ground, and he bends down to pick them up, and his narration continues. Around me, the world whirls about its ludicrous business. It doesn't even realize what it owes me. Jesus, I'm talking like a prat. A paranoid, lonely prat. Then as John hails a taxi, he looks just over the taxi, and we can see the ghosts of John's friends are waving at him, and the narration says, seeing Emma across the street quickens my heart. And John actually waves towards her, and then he realizes that they're not waving at him, they're waving at something else. And as John realizes that, a ghostly figure walks past him and joins the group of friends, and we see it is the ghost of his friend Gary Lester. And the narration says, I suppose I should have guessed. I clench my jaw until my teeth hurt. Sodom. They're only bloody ghosts. Who needs them? And then John walks away in the New York streets. And that is the end of the issue and the end of the first story arc of Hellblazer. So I hope you guys enjoyed that one. I love this story. There's so much cool stuff in it. And it's got to be one of the best introductions to a character that I've ever read. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planes, trains, and comic books, all one word, @gmail.com. And with that, we'll see you guys on the next one.